Thank you for joining us. The American Bar Association Center for Human Rights and the Rule of Law Initiative, as well as the Open Government Partnership, are glad that you're joining us. We invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box. Please note that this event will be recorded and posted to OGP's YouTube channel afterward. Feel free to post questions on the chat throughout the event. But during the Q&A section, after a panel discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions live. We have a great agenda for today's event, especially an excellent speaker roster. So we thank you all for being here. So without further ado, let's begin. My name is Paulina Ornelas, and I am a research associate at the Open Government Partnership. The American Bar Association Center for Human Rights and Rule of Law Initiative are collaborating with OGP to update the state of evidence on civic space. This is part of a larger project that OGP is spearheading to gather the latest evidence on how and when specific open government policies work. In collaboration with partner organizations, researchers have conducted thorough literature reviews on policies such as access to justice, open contracting, and fiscal openness. And OGP has summarized the main findings into a chapter for the Skeptic's Guide to Open Government 2022 edition. So the Skeptic's Guide was published in May 16, of this year. And Peter Noorlander is conducting a literature review with guidance from the American Bar Association on civic space, specifically on what are the impacts of protecting or threatening civic space on different development outcomes. And this chapter will be this literature review will be published as a co-branded standalone literature review, but it will also inform an additional chapter to the Skeptic's Guide. Today, Peter will present his findings from the literature review, and we have invited a panel of experts who will provide him with feedback, recommend conclusions that can be drawn from the literature review, and explore further avenues for research in the field. After the panel discussion, we'll open the floor for discussion, and attendees will be able to present their perspective and their feedback on this. We invite attendees to engage throughout the presentation with your comments and view, and to share any resources that you think might be relevant to this exercise. We'll begin the event with Peter's presentation. Peter is a consultant who has worked in the human rights sector for more than 20 years, focusing on the empowerment of civil society and promotion of freedom of expression as key themes. To avoid taking precious time from his very important presentation, we'll share his full bio in the chat. Peter, many thanks for your work on this. We'll look forward to your presentation. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I also look forward to my presentation because I've only got 7 minutes. So what I'm going to give you is going to be quite a condensed version of this literature review. And I'm really looking forward to the comments from the panelists as well as from the audience. I'm going to share my screen, which is really just to guide my presentation. If you don't see it, you're not actually really missing anything. So I'm not going to make a big thing out of if it doesn't work. Hopefully you can now see it. So I'm looking at the impact of promoting civic space defined as encompassing the freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. And I'm looking at the impact of positive measures, as well as Paulina said, the impact of shrinking civic space. And I'm interested in the impact in 6 areas in particular: development, democracy, corruption, trust in government, public service delivery, and public safety. What I'm doing is a literature review, and I really want to emphasize that. I'm not doing original research. I'm looking at the literature and at the evidence that emerges from that literature for the impact. The literature that I'm looking at is really academic literature. I'm excluding things such as blog posts, pamphlets, campaigning literature. I'm prioritizing empirical literature over theoretical, and I'm focused on literature that's relatively recent from 2015 onwards, and literature that covers several countries rather than just single country literature. For practical reasons, I've only looked at English literature. I can read French and Spanish, but it gives me a tremendous headache, and it just slows me down. So I've not included that. The sources I've looked at have been online, academic databases, websites of leading institutions, some of whom are in the audience here today. I think, as well as I've looked at some actual books printed on actual paper, which was quite refreshing, I have to say. The body of work that I've reviewed, that I've assembled rather, consisted of 189 titles, mostly recent, mostly from academic publishers, and spread across the areas in the way that you can see on your screen. There's a bias towards literature on themes such as democracy, development, and corruption. There was less literature on issues of public safety and trust in government. I'll just give you the headline findings of the literature in each of those areas, and I'm going to bundle them together to save time. So on development and corruption, at a headline level, the data shows a very clear positive correlation. In the area of development, civic space is particularly important at the local level to ensure that development is evenly spread and no one is left behind. There is strong evidence, almost stronger evidence from the closing space literature, which really shows that restrictions on civic space result in less favorable development outcomes, as well as more corruption. There are counter-indicators. So there's a lot of literature on countries such as China, Ethiopia, Rwanda, that appear to achieve development outcomes whilst restricting civic space. But then there are counter-indicators to those counter-indicators, if you know what I mean, which try to explain that. And we can go into that in the Q&A if you like. Impact on democracy, again, really strong positive correlations, but some questions as well around the modern media. Do they still play that ideal kind of role of a watchdog of democracy? There are questions as regards the media being aligned with elites and not necessarily paying or representing all voices in society. There are concerns around social media, polarization of debates, hate speech, uncivil society. But that said, there is some interesting evidence on the impact of newer, mostly digital outlets that have a very strong positive correlation with democracy. The areas of trust in government and public service delivery, if you look at some of the large surveys out there, such as the Eilman Trust Barometer, they're incredibly pessimistic. The literature on that is a bit more even-handed, I would say, and points out that civic space, trust in government, and public service delivery really do walk hand in hand. And it's also worth pointing out negative evidence again. So ICNL research showed that restrictions on civic space in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda had an incredibly negative impact on the response to HIV/AIDS in those countries. And we see the same on the issue of public safety. So really strong evidence of the negative impact from restricting civic space and a strong positive link. That said, there is, of course, the issue of hate speech and issues around civil society groups that pursue illiberal or plain, undemocratic agendas. And the literature does discuss that as well. So these are sort of really in a whirlwind bird's eye overview, the headline findings, which leave some discussion points, though I'm sure that the discussants will have other discussion points as well. One is around definitions, measurements, claiming impact. I'm looking at a whole body of literature and not everybody uses the same terms in the same way. Impact, for example, define impact. Some authors do that differently from others. Having said that, they do all coalesce sort of around the same kind of themes, which I think means that I can draw conclusions from that. There are discussion points around unintended consequences. I've already highlighted the issues of hate speech, uncivil society, illiberal media. I would, however, also really flag up the unintended consequences of restricting civic space because they result in more terrorism. For example, the literature showed quite clear evidence on that. And then there are some under-researched areas. I need to say, first of all, again, I've only looked at English, and that's a huge shortcoming. But I would say that 189 titles, though it sounds like a lot, is probably really small compared to the huge number of projects that are out there that promote civic space. So I would say in conclusion that the area as a whole is probably under-researched and could benefit from more research to bolster the case. I would also say that, look, you can pull things apart and place all sorts of question marks, but on the whole, the literature really strongly supports the case for supporting civic space. And the evidence of the negative impact is even stronger. I'll leave it at that because I've only got 7 minutes and I've gone over that by 40 seconds. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. This is without a doubt a very valuable and thought-provoking literature review that's definitely going to help different kinds of stakeholders like civil society organizations working on the ground, activists, academics. So we really value your work on this, and you leave us some very thought-provoking discussion points that I'm sure that we can address throughout the event. So thank you very much, Peter. We will now move on to our panel. We are joined today by 4 experts on the subject that work around these issues from different trenches. So it will be interesting to know their perspective on what they see or how they feel, what's their perspective of this literature review, to sort of make a sense-making exercise and recommend conclusions out of this literature review. So I'll briefly introduce each one of our panelists, but we'll post their full bios to the chat so that you can visit them there. So joining us today is Anabel Cruz. She is the founder director of the Institute for Communication and Development in Uruguay, and she is the incoming co-chair of OGP Steering Committee. Also joining us is Brian Dooley. He is the senior advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Also Stephanie Muchai. She is the director of partnerships for the International Lawyers Project and a member of OGP Steering Committee. And Doug Rudston, President and CEO of the International Center for Non-for-Profit Law, and a member of OGP Steering Committee. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's very, very interesting to hear your voices and your perspectives on this. So let me kick us off with a question to Anabel. Anabel, in the introduction, I mentioned that this literature review is going to be an input to the Skeptic's Guide to Open Government. And I want to ask, what's your opinion on who are the most important skeptics to convince, and what's the most helpful evidence to convince them? And if I may, a sub question on what's the best way to convey this evidence to convince those skeptics? Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for the invitation. And congratulations to Peter for this very thorough study and a very complete review of literature. To the question, and I have only 4 minutes, less than Peter, about who are the most important acceptors to convince. I think that after 10 years of OGP and a lot of work in promoting open government principles, we still have a long way to go. OGP institutionally is composed by 77 countries and 106 national jurisdictions. So only just there we have skeptic countries or sectors or local jurisdictions that we have to convince. There is here a very wide space for improvement. In terms of the quality of democracy of the countries and jurisdictions belonging to OGP, there is also an important room for improvement. And we have also inside OGP, we have to convince governments, we have to convince national government, we have to convince civil society organizations to be more accountable and more transparent. We have to convince donors to support the work of open government and the work of OGP and the work of organizations promoting open government principles in the field. So a lot of work to be done. It's very difficult to prioritize who are the most important skeptics, but we have quite a few still. So the other question, what is the most helpful evidence for our work to convince the skeptics to bring the unusual suspects, so to say, to OGP? I think that evidence, on the one hand, has to respect some principles, and on the other hand, we can talk also about the format of the evidence. So I think the evidence has to be inclusive. So inclusion, diversity, relevance, timeline. I mean, the oportuna, as we say in Spanish. The evidence has to be actual. So the question is, if academic literature is a medium, is a strong evidence to convince skeptics about the principles of open government and about the importance of open government. And it might be, I think in many cases it is, but just 2 comments about this literature review. I think that choosing only English literature and produced in English, it can bring an important bias to the results. It will end in literature produced in the North or by researchers in the South that have access and resources to publish in English and in peer-reviewed journals in English. There might be, and we know there is evidence in Spanish and French that we should pay attention to. Otherwise, I think that we can act with an important bias and important sort of colonial thought, and we need to decolonize knowledge and research. The other aspect is also the format. We need to transform this knowledge into communicational pieces, useful pieces for activists and researchers in the field, on the ground, that can make use of this in a timely and for better impact or for higher impact. So just these very, very few comments, and I think I have respected my 4 minutes. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. And I totally agree with you. There are still lots of skeptics to convince. And one thing that's a bit counterintuitive about this skeptics guide is that the target audience is not skeptics, but it's actually champions of open government that can use this tool to convince skeptics. So I think what you mentioned is very, very important. I think this is a good way to move on to Brian. Brian, you are with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defender. And your work is sort of different. It's not as academic. So I wanted to ask you regarding the recently published thematic report that the Special Rapporteur has just published on the situation of human rights defender, and ask you how can you relate that report to what we just heard that Peter has found? How does this literature review this literature review that has looked at the impact of protecting civic space on anti-corruption, how do you think it appeals to fighting corruption work?
Sorry, thanks very much. Thanks very much for that. I don't know how many times I've done that. And thanks very much, Peter, for doing all this work. The short answer to your question of how this relates to anti-corruption work being done by human rights defenders, I think is that it relates very closely. Let me say a couple of things at the start before I move on to the specifics. The first is that the Special Rapporteur, Mary Lawler, is on a country visit to Greece at the moment and sends her apologies, and otherwise, if she hadn't been, you would have got her instead of me today. The second thing, Peter, I was pleased to see was the general point you made near the start about whether or not civic space is really closing or changing. And I don't dispute that it's closing, but I think it's important to have a point of comparison. For those of us who are old enough to remember really pre-1990, things don't look so bad. You know, in the 80s, I would say, without having done a scientific study of it, certainly my impression from those days was that in most of the world, things were much worse in terms of civic space than they are now. But certainly since probably the mid-90s, absolutely, I don't disagree that things are worse. But I think the relevance of mentioning that is that we have come back from what I would say is a worse place than this before. And it's easy to talk ourselves into a corner of despondency that things are bad and they're only ever going to get worse. Those of us who are old enough to remember actually things really did turn around there in the early 90s for a while, may have more grounds for optimism. In terms of, you know, what I absolutely recognized and sprung out as, yes, that's exactly what we saw when we were researching the anti-corruption report, was the correlation that Peter outlines there between press freedom and successful anti-corruption work. But as he says, it's got to be the right sort of press freedom. I mean, it's got to be public interest journalism, not celebrity journalism. Also, he notes the emerging importance of social media in battling corruption, and we see that in many parts of the world. I mean, our evidence is anecdotal rather than academic, but certainly that's backed up. I'd say too, I think what was curious and surprising to us when we worked on the report, that the anti-corruption space is a bit of a weird place in terms of civic society. Many of the big anti-corruption, national, regional, international anti-corruption initiatives don't have much to say about the importance of the freedom of civic space. They're much more likely to focus on, you know, government campaigns around nepotism or bribery to pass laws to try and prevent corruption, all good things. But really, the importance of human rights defenders working against corruption, the importance of even of press freedom, which you might think would be more obvious, to help fight corruption is often an afterthought and sometimes just isn't there at all. I think this also is tied to something else, which is a little curious, which is it's not obvious everywhere that corruption is a human rights issue. I mean, it's said often, but I think the fact that it needs to be said, that people feel like there needs to be a reminder, tells its own stories. Many people working against corruption are not recognized as human rights defenders when they are. And so there's a little bit of a weird relationship between civic space and anti-corruption work. I'd say they were the main things that struck me when I read the report, except one thing I really am very grateful for, which is on Friday, I'm going to Vienna to give a speech to a UN body about anti-corruption work, and I will be shamelessly citing you, but stealing this work, because it's really very useful to try and convince some of those people that, you know, that really, if you want to have successful anti-corruption work, you need to have a free and open and enabled civic space. So thank you very much for all that work, Peter. It's great.
Thank you, Brian. And that's exactly the purpose and the point. So we're very glad that you're using it and that you're starting to convince skeptics right from the start. So thank you very much. So right now, I'd like to address a bit of those situations that you've outlined, Brian, and that Peter has also mentioned as sort of these counter indicators. So I'd like to move on to Steph and ask you, Steph. So the literature identifies some unintended consequences of protecting civic space, such as when civic space is populated by groups that have anti-democratic purposes, or when there is a strong media presence, but there's state capture of that media presence. So as Brian was saying, this the prerequisite for this good relationship to happen, for this positive relationship, is that there has to be public interest journalism. So I want to ask, in your experience working in such contexts where these unintended consequences have happened, how do you strike the balance between prioritizing counter disinformation or protecting democratic freedoms?
Thanks, Paulina, and join everyone in saying thank you to Peter for the great work, and thank you, Brian, for that call to optimism. Very much behind that. So, Paulina, to your question, I'll just start with a quote from former President Barack Obama, who was speaking at Stanford University on disinformation. And in that conversation, he said something that struck me. He said that democracies have become dangerously complacent, and that recent events around disinformation have shown the world that democracy is neither inevitable nor self-executing. Citizens must nurture it. I thought that was a very good reflection and sentiment to start off the conversation on. I think also just understanding that not everyone is on board this fight against disinformation. There are growing audiences for anti-democratic ideals. I would put those two audiences in two main groups. So those that never believed in democracy to start with, but those that are losing trust in democratic ideals and institutions. And then there are those that are being manipulated based on some nature of marginalization or vulnerability in things like ethnic, gender, economic, or other marginalization. And then there are toxic minorities, such as racial supremacy groups that are peddling disinformation about supposed extinction and preservation. So there's everything on the ground is not great. There's really a warring appetite for disinformation. Most social media platforms report in their analytics high engagement on content that is sensational, conspiratorial, just information that startles the senses, really. And there's research showing more and more that people don't care about the facts. They're okay with opinions, and they thrive more on likes and reactions than on truth. And so it's just to underscore what's happening in the situation on the ground, but also as we discuss and emphasize the responsibility on the whole ecosystem, that's from government, social media platforms, and citizens, that it's a really important conversation, and that we need to get everybody on board. Not everybody is on board with this good cause. So I'll just touch on a few proposed measures that I think are relevant to strike the balance between countering disinformation and protecting democratic freedom.
Sorry, Steph, I think we lost you for a bit. Can you hear us okay?
I'll focus on freedom of expression and access to information rights and all of that comes with more minutes. And I'll start off by focus on freedom of expression. I can hear you okay, Paulina? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. Sorry about that. I think there's a freeze. So my first baseline would be to say that any actions that combat disinformation should uphold and support the right of freedom of expression, not violate the right. I know that Peter's study referenced a global study that found discontent with democracy, even when people believed in free speech. But I still think that the importance of this right in the fight of disinformation must be underscored, preserved, and advanced as well. Because we're talking about democracy, I think a good starting point would be for politicians and any kind of public official really to make commitments not to engage in manipulating public opinion, ensuring that their teams fact check all political content before it's used on any of their platforms. And that includes not disseminating other people's disinformation. And while there are more ordinary citizens than there are politicians and public officials, thank God, we have really seen recently and in the last couple of years that politicians, where they are the sources and amplifiers of the disinformation, the impact on democracy and democratic ideals and values not only regresses and degenerates, but it does cause real harm to people's lives and to their livelihoods. I think that states should be taking action to really focus on their transparency measures and also very much on proactive disclosure of official information and data. And I think that this should happen regardless of whether they have an access to information law, whether they have constitutional provisions requiring them to do that, because this would be a fantastic tool in terms of providing citizens, media journalists, with a reference to accurate and true information for them to engage their democratic responsibilities and freedoms. So I think that states need to put their best foot forward to improve the quality of the information ecosystem. And that will, of course, increase trust in public institutions, as we know. My next proposed measure is around media. You asked about media where there's state capture. You know, the good thing about traditional media is they do, in ideal circumstances, depend on fact checking, verifying ethics, and all that great stuff. Unfortunately, in situations where it's not possible to then put all this information out, I think that there needs to be a lot of support, whether this is from funders or citizens and crowdsourcing and things like that, for online media platforms. And I don't just mean blogs and things like that, but people that are bound to these ethics and this fact checking, and just increase that pluralism online of the presence and sustainability of those online media voices that are bound by the traditional ethics, but are able to be online to express without any fear of kind of shutdowns from governments or any other regressive measures from state capture. Unfortunately, there is still growing online violence targeting journalists like there is offline. And so any measures to promote this would have to work in tandem or parallel to making sure that all the offline protections for journalists apply online. And if there are any weak measures offline, that they be strengthened, but that we move those online as well. And then lastly, just to touch on law enforcement agencies and the judiciary, I think it's important that they be supported to understand and uphold legitimate limitations on freedom of expression, and also best practices around intermediary liability. I think, which in this case, in this context, is more on social media platforms, so that they can be able to effectively tackle disinformation, but like I started off saying, while upholding the freedom of expression and the cornerstones, basically, of democratic values. So those would be my thoughts on that, Polina. Happy to discuss further in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Steph. You've definitely given us a lot to discuss further in the next session, but I think that you've raised a very important issue, and that there is a demand for this information, and any measures should take that into account. So I think that's a very, very important point to bear in mind. So last but not least, I'd like to move on to Doug and ask you, Doug, regarding the skeptics that we've discussed, the different types of skeptics that we've mentioned. To what extent are instrumental arguments for fundamental human rights good? And where should we be careful, in your opinion?
Thank you, Paulina, and special thanks to Peter for your exceptional research. It's nice to see you all. 3 short responses and a recommendation. 1, governments have committed to protect civic freedom through the ICCPR and other legally binding instruments. Similarly, in the OGP Declaration, OGP members already commit to protecting the ability of not-for-profit and civil society organizations to operate in ways consistent with the freedoms of expression, association, and opinion. So responding to your question, Paulina, I think it is risky to instrumentalize civic freedom. Why? We inadvertently lend legitimacy to the argument that governments can decide whether to honor their treaty commitments and their OGP obligations based on their self-perception of national security, economic interests, or other development outcomes. So that's one risk. 2, if we go down the road of instrumentalization, I think we have to be really careful about framing. Peter, you picked this up nicely in your report. There's a reference to development outcomes being achieved in places without civic space, like China. But of course, we need a more nuanced concept of development. It's not just economic growth, it's inclusive and sustainable development. Development that helps groups marginalized by power and patriarchy, that address the climate crisis, that are viewed as legitimate by the public. It can't just be economic growth. And perhaps, Peter, and I know you're sensitive to this, that's part of the counter-indicator to the counter-indicator, that we need to look at inclusive and sustainable development outcomes, not just economic growth. Third, as we talk about framing, we have to be really careful about adopting the other side's framing. I see this in the US, where the MAGA Republicans are saying, we told you that under Joe Biden, you would have high gas prices and the stock market would plummet. That's exactly what's happening. And they're saying, as a result, in fact, there was a Twitter storm over the weekend where a well-meaning Democratic activist said, would you choose democracy or $2.50 gas prices? And putting even the trolls aside, so many people were opting for cheaper gas and modified democracy. I think we have to be really careful about putting all our eggs in the basket of saying, well, ta-da, here's the argument. Civic-based democracy and human rights lead to economic growth, sustainable development, and other outcomes. Instead, I think we need to take a step back and come up with an argument on why democracy, human rights, and civic space are intrinsically good. We need to make that case stronger and not rely so much, because the lived experience of people may actually undermine that argument and open the door to authoritarianism. So finally, my recommendation. I think this is a fascinating conversation. I teach at Georgetown Law. I'd love to have this conversation and invite you, Peter, to talk to my class. I'm not convinced, I'll be a skeptic to the skeptic's guide, that this actually will help convince government points of contact. In fact, as I look at the participant list, I think there are few, if any, POCs who participated in this conversation. I don't think they really care so much about this broad discussion about the correlation between civic space and economic outcomes and development and so forth. I think for many of them, they're more interested in how these issues will affect their day-to-day work. So my suggestion for future research is, instead of asking us how to convince the skeptics, maybe we need to engage with the OGP, governmental points of contact, more directly. And maybe instead of just this intellectual analysis, which I find to be fascinating, we need to do a better political and bureaucratic analysis about what's holding them back from making civic space commitments in their national action plans. And are there ways that we might be able to provide additional arguments on why they should engage with this more, both within their own offices and as they engage with other government officials. So thanks again, Peter. Fantastic research, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Doug. I think you've raised another important issue, and it is that we cannot see these things as black or white or yes or no answers. There are so many nuances and so many things at play. And I think that in how we portray this evidence or how we try to convince skeptics is where we can either lose them or get them to join our side. So I think that's also very important. So at this point, we can move on to our discussion. We can open it up for questions and comments from participants. And while we start gathering questions, I would encourage attendees to either pose your questions to the chat or even raise your hand virtually using the function at the top of the bottom of your screen. And you can pose your question live. You can open your mic and turn your camera on. And while we start gathering questions, I want to ask you, Peter, if you have any reactions to the interventions from our panelists. I think that they've all been very, very interesting and thought-provoking. So I want to give you a few moments if you want to react to these interventions.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for reading it, first of all, because that was 25 really dense pages. So I'm very grateful for you for engaging with that. I really take on board the criticism as regards the language, and I'm totally I totally agree with that. But it is the practical limitation that I work with. I would just point so to say that points to a need for further research in other languages. And I would, however, say that a lot of the field that I've covered has been multi-country, and it's been people studying data sets, which do cover, various different countries around the world. So it's not purely a northern analysis of what happens in other countries. And in fact, there's a lot of analysis of North America, as well as Europe, West, East, and Central, and other parts. I see that there's a couple of questions already in on the chat. And so maybe instead of me going point by point with what everybody else has said, we should engage with that, because there isn't that much time left, Paulina.
Okay, sounds good. We have a question in the chat from Elizabeth Donkervoort from the American Bar Association. Elizabeth, if you want to expand on your question and do it live, feel free to raise your hand virtually. Otherwise, Elizabeth's question is, in response to the recommendations for governments to take steps to improve the information ecosystem, do panelists have examples of effective regulatory regimes or policies, for example, education reform, to achieve this recommendation? If any of our panelists want to jump in, feel free to do so. And we also have our colleagues from the American Bar Association Center for Human Rights and the Rule of Law Initiative, as well as from OGP. If you want to chime in, feel free to do so. But if any one of you want to address any recommendations on how to improve this information ecosystem from a practical perspective.
I can maybe say that I don't have an example of an effective regulatory regime or policy, and just highlight how most governments are dealing with it at the moment is under other laws like libel, defamation, hate speech, and that kind of framework is where we're seeing most governments operating. But it's a really good question, and I hope that we can well, some of my other panelists have another answer, or that we can go back and think about.
Thank you,
And I've
Steph.
taken the liberty.
Peter.
Sorry,
go ahead, Doug.
And I was just saying, I've shared in the chat a link to our disinformation policy briefer, if that's helpful, Elizabeth. Thank you for an excellent question.
Thanks so much, Doug. Peter, do you want to jump in?
Maybe just really briefly, media and information literacy can work really well, but it's got to be done properly and in an apolitical kind of way, and that's a whole minefield in itself. I would say that anything that supports independent quality journalism is going to be really useful, and you can do that through tax breaks. You have to look at the economic situation that a lot of the media are in, and you can look at promoting journalism education and all that kind of stuff, not requiring it, mind you, but really investing in all of the infrastructure that essentially underlies a good and healthy media ecosystem. And it's that kind of investment, rather than, like Steph I think also said earlier, rather than anything that is negative and that restricts freedom of expression even further.
Thank you, Peter. We can take more questions from attendees if you want to raise your hand or put them in the chat. But meanwhile, I have a question of my own for panelists. And I'd love to know, how do you engage with government officials that see anti-corruption activists as more nuisance than benefit from your different trenches? Brian at the United Nations, or Doug, Steph, Annabelle from civil society. How do you deal with people that are the second kind of skeptics that Steph mentioned, people who used to believe but are now disenchanted?
I'll go first if you like. I mean, you know, let's be frank, some of these people are not just skeptics, right? I mean, they're enemies of some governments are not just skeptical about anti-corruption. I mean, they attack and enable attacks on anti-corruption activists, and we've seen from our point of view that corruption is working on corruption is one of the most dangerous areas for a human rights defender to be engaged on. Dangerous as in, most likely to be physically attacked or murdered. I think there was research done by an NGO cited in the Special Rapporteur's report, I think, saying that for women human rights defenders, corruption was the most dangerous area for them to be working in. So when you're confronted with not just skepticism, but really, hostility, then you need to fall back on those techniques of publicly naming governments and calling for inquiries into attacks. I mean, there's also clearly a correlation between corruption and the murders of human rights defenders. We find, I mean, the numbers vary a little, and they're certainly underreporting, but at least 300 human rights defenders are murdered every year. And a large part of the reason of that is corruption within criminal justice systems, which then does not really enable perpetrators to be brought to account. So corruption itself really fuels the murder of human rights defenders. And so, some of these audiences that we're addressing are really very tough. I mean, some of these authoritarian and other regimes, are behind the killings of people working in that part of civic space, and so you can do the reasoned persuasion stuff, and you sort of have to, but really in the end you have to call this out for the crime that it is, the crime of attacking civil society. I mean, I hear a lot this phrase, the closing of civil society space, and as I say, I agree, it's a real thing. It's a little sanitized, frankly, for me, because the end of it I see are people being murdered, and closing civil society space sounds a bit of a polite way of saying that. So when it comes to how do we confront people who are skeptical, I think we have to tell them why it's in their own interest and the government's interest to have a healthy democracy. It promotes stability and all the rest of it. Not many government officials who are behind those sorts of attacks are really open to that, I find. And so then you're back to, you signed up for this, and we're going to publicly shame you, and we're going to try and bring court proceedings if we can. So, that sort of discussion gets pretty tough pretty quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Steph, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. A few approaches that we have taken is working on existing commitments that states have already said. So we have made, so we go up and say, you said, and we want to help you implement this. That has had some measure of success because you're basing it on something, and it kind of diffuses a lot of arguments about where you're coming from. The second one is to take a sectoral approach to an area that the public cares about. So for example, health, and that's helpful in terms of getting public support, media coverage, noise, and a push around the area. The third one, I would say, civil society partnering with governments in terms of an area of efficiency. And they have a solution that supports efficiency, but has the byproduct of dealing with corruption, and that could be in procurement or in various areas like that. And the last one is to begin engagements perhaps in low stakes areas. So for example, while working on open contracting in the region, one of the areas that we targeted were affirmative action contracts for persons with disability, youth, and women. The reality is that the contract value is not so high. The reality is, in the corruption world, nobody really cares about the affirmative action contracts, but that it gives an opportunity to test and implement anti-corruption measures, and then start kind of to see the results, and then begin to try and push into more of the high stakes areas. So existing commitments, sectoral approaches, partnering on efficiency that has an anti-corruption effect, and then going into low stakes areas as a beginning.
Thanks so much, Steph. I think you and Brian have given marvelous, very practical recommendations. Thank you. Annabelle, please go ahead.
Thank you, Paulina. Just to agree on Brian's reflection about the that it's very difficult to find a government official or anybody defending corruption. They know very well its dangers, and when it happens because its hostility and it's of course other problems than just considering civil society activists or anti-corruption activists a nuance a problem. So just to mention that from civil society organizations, the creation of safety networks, and that has to do also with a question that is in the chat about how to counteract impunity. Safety networks promoted by civil society, resilience of civil society organizations that are in very close contact with the stakeholders and the people they work with, can bring extra support and extra protection for activists in different areas. And I agree that human rights defenders, and environmental defenders are one of the most threatened groups. But journalists, how many journalists are assassinated every year just because of the disseminating this kind of opinion? So just this tiny contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. And I think that this is an area that hopefully we're moving forward towards, as Steph was mentioned, maybe going in the sectorial or policy area direction. I think the Escazú agreement and the protection of human rights defender in environmental areas, I think is a good step forward, although there's still a lot to be done, because as a question from Suchi Pandey in the chat was mentioning, how do you combat impunity when it's actually the state who's perpetrating those crimes? So I think this is, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but we're still not there quite. We have Alessandro from the OECD. You have your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this opportunity and this platform and the excellent report, Peter. It's great to be able to discuss civic space and democracy. We so many brilliant minds and practitioners, and I wanted to just share two considerations that are occupying our minds at the OECD. We will soon publish our first global report on civic space. And I was struck by 2 points, one made by Annabelle about decolonizing the space. I think the issue is absolutely correct, of course, but it's also broader. The OECD used to be mostly colonial powers, but it's not anymore. And we do include Spanish and French sources in our work. Still, I find that even there, you find approaches that are very aligned with approaches that are more traditionally from northern countries. So I think now the issue is not necessarily anymore north-south, but maybe more radical versus orthodox approaches. And I enjoyed when the OGP launched the feminist OGP. I wonder whether we shouldn't maybe think of something like a radical OGP, or at least looking at those theories of democracies that are challenging the status quo from perspectives that are not orthodox, but they are not necessarily divided along the lines of north-south. You can find a lot of these also in European countries, etc. And we're trying to intercept them, but it's not easy. But I'm not sure that necessarily by expanding the languages, you also expand necessarily the points of view, unfortunately, in these issues. The one point I wanted to stress. And the other one, Doug point on the intrinsic value of democracy. I think it resonates very well with us, but at the same time, we are finding in the report that a lot of healthy democracies are reducing or closing or polarizing civic space with full support of, if not the majority, at least a big part of the population. These actions are nested sometimes in broader policy reforms, but the effect is to make almost impossible for civic space to function in a healthy way, because it is divided between friends and enemies, and this brings violence, it brings oppression, etc. And therefore, the intrinsic value of democracy seems obvious to us, but sometimes citizens in established democracies don't seem to see the repercussions of certain electoral decisions on some fundamental values that we give for granted. And so that's why we also try to link democracy with concrete impact on citizens' life, to make the case that there is also a functional value of democratic regimes, but it's being challenged more and more, even in the OECD, which was called the club of democracies in the past, and some of our democracies are not doing well in the field of civic space. So these 2 points, sort of aligning ourselves also with more radical critique of the status quo, and also try to bridge the importance of stressing of the value of democracy per se, but also linking it with something that resonates to those people that live in democracy, but are willing to undermine civic space if it is put against increasing minimum salary or a sense of security against migrants, etc. And that it's a very complex job. I don't have answers. I'm just asking. I'm just stressing issues that are in our minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandro. We're unfortunately running out of time. We have excellent questions on the chat, and I hope that we continue a conversation. But I'm wondering if any of our panelists, or Peter, or colleagues at ABA or OGP, would like to present some closing remarks to finish our discussion. I think we've touched on a lot of different points. So if any one of you want to jump in to make some final remarks, please feel free to do so.
Paulina, if I may, this is Joe Foti. I'm the Chief Research Officer at OGP, and I work on Paulina's team. First, thank you to Peter and to our colleagues at ABA and to all the panelists for attending today. That's great. This is part of a longer standing engagement with these important issues of freedom of assembly, association, and expression that are fundamental to both the success of OGP, but also it achieving its goals. They are its goals in a sense. And so I would say this is a middle chapter of a longer book. We've collated and gathered all of the arguments in international law in prior work that we've done, and now we're gathering some of the instrumental arguments. And I hear the call to do a bit more research on this fundamental barriers within organizations, within agencies, within politics. And I think that's a lovely next step. And so everyone here, I would just invite them to continue attending, thinking about how we can gather all of these different approaches, the political, the rights-based, and the instrumental, and put them all to work to achieve something that we're all trying to, that we all believe in, and that we have evidence for now as well.
Thank you so much, Joe. We're unfortunately at time, but I want to thank once again Peter for all of your work on this, and our panelists today, Doug, Brian, Steph, Annabelle, as well as our colleagues at the American Bar Association, Salome, Jay, Lena. Thank you so much for all your work on this. The literature review that Peter is finalizing will be available later this summer, as well as the additional chapter of the Skeptic Guide. So please feel free to look for it later this summer in OGP's website. We've posted a link to the chat. And we thank you all for attending this event, for your comments. And if you have any other questions or comments, we invite you to engage with us. You can reach us at research@opengovpartnership.org if you have any additional comments or feedback for Peter. Thank you all for coming, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.